Vamos a comenzar con esta mesa redonda que tiene por título Percepciones de comportamiento para las políticas de bienestar. This is the Roundtable on Behavioral Insights for Well-Being Policy. Para presentar a los ponentes y para fungir como moderador, as a moderator and to introduce the speakers, I leave you with Sama Abdallah, Senior Researcher and Program Manager, Wellbeing, New Economics Foundation, UK. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much. In the 20th century, a new species was claimed to exist. This new species looked very much like human beings. They had the same diets. Apparently, they could even interbreed with humans. And yet, they had some quite distinctive features. And the main distinctive feature was in terms of their decision-making abilities. They made decisions in a way very different to Homo sapiens. For example, they were able to consider all the options possible and to choose the one that was optimal for them, particularly in terms of material gain. They didn't consider emotions such as pride or anger when they made decisions, and they didn't even consider the impact of their decisions on other people unless it then had an impact on themselves. If you offered them a banana, they would reject the banana if you then said you would give them a slightly bigger banana, maybe 5% bigger, a year later. Sadly, Homo economicus, this species, never ever existed. And it's a shame because public policy would have been a lot easier if it did. Instead, we have Homo sapiens, and we have a lot of complicated things that we need to try and understand about us. And that's where behavioral insights come in. Just to kind of give you a little flavor of the issues that we face, I'm going to show you a short video. It's a little challenge. What you need to do when you watch this video, you're going to see two teams passing a ball, one in white and one in black. And I want you to count how many times the team in white passed the ball. The team in white, okay? If you've seen this before, then don't tell the answers to your friends, because obviously, you know, it'll give the game away. So, if we could have the video, please. Okay, how many passes were there? 16, the correct answer is 16. But did everyone see the gorilla? Yes? Did not everyone saw the gorilla? Hands up if you saw the gorilla. Oh, actually quite a good number. Okay, so some of you may have seen this already. In fact, 50% of people don't see the gorilla at all. But actually, another thing, you might have seen the gorilla, but you might have missed two other things. One thing is that the curtain changed color, and another thing is that one of the players disappeared. So maybe if we could just see the last bit of the video again, please. The last from 13 seconds. Here's the gorilla. If you didn't see them before, you really should have. And you'll notice that one of the team, the black team, has gone, and the curtain has changed color. So the lesson is that we do make mistakes, and this is an example of attention blindness, where when you're paying attention to one thing, the white players, you miss other things, such as the gorilla or the curtains, or many other things that might have happened, which we didn't show you. And there's lots of examples of this. We're starting to use this kind of knowledge, this kind of evidence in terms of the cognitive biases and errors we make as humans in our policy making, and we've got a great panel to talk about that today. I'm going to introduce them as they speak. So first up will be Elisa Bane, who is Managing Director at Ideas 42, which is a not-for-profit consultancy that uses behavioral science to solve society's most difficult problems. She was previously Latin American Director and founding Mexico Director, so she has a lot of experience in this area, and she has a background in political economy and public policy. Can I also just remind you before Elisa speaks, we will be taking lots of questions today because we're only going to be speaking 5 minutes each, so you'll have time to ask questions. But the best way to do it, given that the audience is so big, is to use the Wissembly website. So if you do have questions, then please type them into the Assembly website, and we'll be looking at them on this pad. Thank you. Elisa.
Hello? Can you hear me? Great. Well, thank you, Sima, and also thank you to the organizers. It's really nice to have a session on behavioral insights, because to get policy right, part of what we need to do is to really design and implement it correctly. And so it's the how-to. And what really excites me about behavioral insights and behavioral science is how making small, often simple, inexpensive changes to policies or programs can have these outsized effects. So to give you a classic example, something most of you may be familiar with right now is the example of retirement savings and switching the default for that. So we in some cases, went from a system where people had to opt in, had to enroll themselves, to a system where people were automatically enrolled and could choose to opt out. So in one study, we saw that this changed the number of people who were actually participating in the retirement plan by 30 percentage points. Now, any economist would say that you would need an unimaginable subsidy to get that type of change, that type of increase in people participating in savings. And we see that this works, this behavioral solution works, because people have this intention to save already. They're just having trouble following through on it. And they're having trouble following through because to enroll means I have to fill out an application, and we all love filling out forms. And you have to make some tough decisions in there. You have to think about how much can I save, when can I start saving, where should I invest? So these tough decisions can slow us down a little bit. And on top of it, there's no deadline for saving. So all of these things can cause us to say, well, tomorrow I'll deal with this. And tomorrow can become 6 months later, it can become 3 years later sometimes. So what we see is, for most of us, for many things, we make these decisions and we act in a way that isn't always matching our intentions. And that's where, understanding human behavior and bringing a what we call a behavioral lens to problems is really important in forming policies, because what we want to do is form policies for how people really are, rather than forming policies for how we imagine people should be. So that's what we do at Ideas 42. We originally created at Harvard to bring the academic knowledge that we know from the behavioral sciences into the real world, with the goal of helping millions of people. And we work with, around the world with a number of partners to improve social policies and programs using this behavioral lens. And we've been able to work, behavioral insights span across many areas, so we've been able to do things like decrease dropout rates for students. We've been able to increase the amount of people who are taking medication for chronic diseases, or significantly reduce the amount of teens who are involved in violent activity. And the key to all of this is understanding the problem for what it is. And in many cases, we often think, we go to these favorite solutions, which are, if we just give people better information, they'll know what to do and they'll be able to do it. Or if we just structure incentives a little bit better. But we see that even when the incentives are in a good place, for example, with retirement savings, even with a match there, you have the incentive to save, but you just are having trouble following through on it. So it's, how can we bring this behavioral lens to think about problems a little bit differently and create solutions that can really have these kind of amplified effects for the policies themselves. So I'll just give one more example. It's a project we worked on in South Africa. And in this project, we're working with the government, and there was concern around young girls having relationships with older men and the risk of HIV transmission. And conventional wisdom there would say, okay, let's just give these girls more information about the risk of activity with these older men, and that will reduce their relationships and reduce the HIV transmission risk. So with the best of intentions, the government rolled out this campaign which gave more information to these girls about, these older men are risky. But when we started investigating in the problem, we realized the problem was actually much deeper than just an information problem. The problem was a misperception of risk. these girls knew that there could be some risk of engaging in relationships with older men, but they actually thought incorrectly that it was safer than having relationships with younger men, because they see in front of them right now the relationships that these other men are having, but they're not thinking about the cumulative lifetime risk of these older men. And so what we did is we created a game, a quick HIV computer game, education game, which reframed these risks, and found that several months later, those who participated and got this game rather than the traditional education around HIV were able to report back about the difference in relative risks between younger and older men by about 40 percentage points. So in this example, what we did was we reframed information and we corrected the misperceptions in order to help these young women have the preferences and make the decisions that they need to be and that they wanted to be making. In the example about retirement savings, it's about, in that environment, it's about what can we do to change the process to help people follow through on their own intentions. And so just to sum it up, I'd say, how can we be thinking about using behavioral science and bringing this lens so that we can have this design policies for how people really are and have this outsized influence, have this amplify the impact of the policies we're creating.
Thank you very much, Elisa. That's a great example, particularly the last one, and just such a huge impact. I wanted to ask you, in a way, you've sort of broken down the behavioral insights into two aspects. One is the sort of the diagnoses, the sort of the way that we're able to learn better about the problems we face. And I think Anna will be talking about that as well a little bit later in terms of sort of identifying the problems. And the second is sort of the kind of interventions we do afterwards. And so some of the examples you gave, for example, with the retirement in terms of opting in and opt-out, are often described as sort of nudges, the sort of small things that you can do where you're not, you're not forcing anyone to do anything, and you're not having to impose some huge tax or anything like that. They're very innocuous. Now, that's often seen as quite important particularly in sort of more liberal societies such as the UK and the US, where politicians are very wary of having a sort of more tougher policy. No one in the US or the UK would consider the kind of policies they had in China in terms of reducing the number of children. I'm just wondering, how does the size of the effects compare? Can we compare the impacts of sort of these kind of more nudge-like interventions with some of these more sort of, you might say brutal interventions that have been taking place in other countries?
With the more routine interventions?
More brutal or more regulatory, I guess.
So I don't think of the nudge, and I should say that most of these behavioral interventions can be very small and simple, but they can also be a little bit more intensive. And really what we're looking for is where can we, for the amount we invest in them, really get these very large impacts from them that we don't see without having this behavioral view. And I wouldn't think of using behavioral insights as an and/or question, or really not an or question. I would be thinking about it as, how can we use this as a tool like we use other ones? Monitoring and evaluation is now mainstream in how we think about creating policies and programs. Human behavior, if human behavior is part of any policy or program, how do we make that now part of anything that we create and do? So really, I think of it more as a tool to help amplify what we're doing, and in some cases, it can help us not have to create as large of a subsidy or as large of a tax. We can often see results without having to, bring forward that tax. But I would think of it really as, how can we be thinking about using human behavior, our insights on that, to amplify whatever we're intending to achieve for well-being.
Thank you very much. Okay, next up we'll have Anna Frutero, who's the senior economist at the Poverty and Equity Global Practice at the World Bank. She has been the core team member in the 2015 Mind, Society and Behavior Report, and has extensive experience also in Latin America and the Caribbean. So Anna, please.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's really great. And when you asked the questions, you asked us, tell us about what have you so excited about behavioral insights. For me, since I participated in the World Development Report 2015, it's really changed the way I go about doing my work. It really challenges a lot of the things that I thought, I knew. And then there are a lot of policies that you see that are effective, and hence that's just extremely exciting to see results on the ground. But then when I was thinking about, my journey to now, over the last, few years in which I've done quite a lot of thinking into behavioral economics, what I realized is that, I'm an economist, I'm a trade economist, but I'm also a human being, which is not always true. Some economists are not really human beings, or they don't really look too much like human beings. They don't act so. So, very often in my daily life, I would see that the things that I learn in school, yeah, it's true. What I learn in school, I also see happening in real life, but other things are a little bit harder to reconcile. So you study something, like, I don't know, in school that we assume that we are infinitely lived. That was an easy one. We know we are not infinitely lived, everyone. But when I heard about this experiment that I'm going to tell you in a second, I saw how it's not just me who see this inability to reconcile some things that we study in school with what we see in reality. And it's the following. So I'm from Italy. In Italy, the prices of goods when we go to buy them in the store are the prices including of taxes, right? So you see the price, you go and buy a hairbrush, it's, €1, you go and you pay €1. In the US, where I've lived now for many years, the price is excluding taxes. So it tells you 90 cents, and then you go to the cashier, to the counter, and you pay $1.2, by $1.02. And you're like, every time I get surprised, despite having lived there for many years. And you think, well, that's just me, that I'm just, a little bit slow, and I cannot get used to this, and I cannot compute these numbers, and so every time I go, I pay. The fact that the tax has to be added, I kind of get surprised. Well, hear this. They did an experiment in the US where they had, in some drugstores and convenience stores, the price tag was expressed like we do in Italy and in many parts of the world, where the price including the tax. So the price looks higher, right? In the end, what you pay at the cashier is the same in either of the two worlds. Now, what they found is that the demand for the goods decreased by 8%. So, we as economists, we understand that as the price goes up, demand goes down. But it's really difficult for standard economics to reconcile the fact that the way in which the price is presented changes individual behavior. So this is an example of where what we experience as people every day, I constantly am reminded of the fact that the way in which something is expressed, the price is expressed, affects the way in which I make my choices about my purchases, choices, and firms often take this into account and to their advantage, but really shows how there are certain things that with standard economics, certain types of behavior that with just standard economics we cannot explain. Now, bear in mind that I still, this is not to say that, we throw the economics standard models out of the window. Absolutely not. I think the simplifying assumptions that are used in order to make models tractable and to understand the workings of the economy are very important, and they allow us to solve models that otherwise would be impossible to solve, and they explain a lot of the behavior that we observe. But when we go into thinking about policies, Elisa was saying, we also need to really think, when we think about our intervention, we need to really take into account how people really think. So what we do what we did in the WDR, we present a lot of examples of interventions that use these insights that basically, there are three principles that we discuss in the WDR. The first one is that people think automatically. We are not always deliberative thinkers. We are not always making the choices considering all the costs and benefits of any choice we make. Very often when we decide what route to go from one place to the other, we just choose the route that we always take, or the first time we did. We just, go with what we are used to. We're not trying to think, oh, where is the traffic? And, on Wednesday there is more traffic here. On Thursday there is more traffic there. We just go. So we think automatically. The other thing is we're social animals. So the way in which the people around us think and act affects the way we act and think. So we think socially. And the third principle is that the way in which we interpret reality, the way in which the framework that we use to interpret what happens around us also depends on where we have lived, our culture, what's being done around us. And so this is what we call thinking with mental models. Now, accounting for this more complex, if you want, way of thinking that individuals have can bring about very innovative and effective policies. And it's not about, it's not about replacing tools. Policymakers have tools to affect behavior. It's enlarging the set of tools that policymakers have at their disposal. So at the bank, there are a lot of initiatives that try to help also our client countries, the governments we work with, take advantage of these tools. So we have had some interventions in, for example, in Central America. Being in Mexico, I thought I would give examples of nearby countries, where in Guatemala, in order to increase the amount of tax payments, what the tax authorities tried to do was to send letters, reminders, that would use precisely the social thinking, telling people how many other people had already paid their taxes. So taking advantage of the fact that we know that most individuals like to do what the rest of us does, to comply with what the rest of the people do. And the other kind of reminders was about the fact that despite not having paid for many years, so the fact that the status quo was not having paid because you forget, because you procrastinate, the right thing to do was to actually pay taxes. Well, these letters actually did improve an increase in tax payments. And Guatemala is a country in which tax revenues are really low. So finding ways in which one can, without even having to pass a law, but can increase tax payments is really very important. Another intervention that was done with Ideas 42 in Costa Rica was trying to induce people in a municipality to reduce water consumption. Water consumption was incredibly high, much higher than the average in the country. They tried increasing prices, but prices couldn't be increased more than cost recovery. So they started using these messages, these stickers on the utility bill that were stating how much less consumption, what was the average consumption of the neighborhood and the city in which the individuals were. And making reference to the neighborhood, showing how in the neighborhood people were consuming less, was really effective in inducing a behavior change in reducing water consumption. So these are just small examples of what the bank is currently doing. There are these things are increasing, I would say, almost by the day, as more and more countries are realizing the potential of these interventions. Now, but I want to tell you one other thing, because yes, there are all these interventions, but to me, one other important message of the WDR is the fact that in order, basically, what these behavioral insights, what opening up the black box of human cognition, how do we make decisions, really underscores the fact that there are many different reasons for which people end up doing a similar thing, right? The reason why a young woman might have sexual intercourse for an older man in South Africa or in a certain area of South Africa could be very different from the one in the United States or in Mexico or in India. Right? Hence, there are many more reasons. In some cases, it might be just a question of information, right? In others, it might not be information, or it might be the way the information is conveyed and it's assimilated by the person. But so, what really becomes important is to have a good diagnosis of why people do what they're doing. Unless we have a good diagnosis of the reasons behind an observed behavior, how can we design an intervention that attacks this cause? I always say, I have kids, and so when you have kids, you always bring them to the doctors because they have an ear infection. The ear infection can be bacterial or viral. I'm almost done. Now, if it's bacterial, you have to give antibiotics. If it's viral, you shouldn't do anything. It will go. And the antibiotics don't do anything for the viral. Now, one could say, well, you have the kid, he or she has a pain in the ear, is crying all the time, just give them the antibiotics. If it's bacterial, it will do something. If it's viral, it will not do anything, but it will pass. Well, I personally think that, well, when you give antibiotics to a kid, there are also some negative consequences. Giving a drug, unnecessary drug, has negative consequences. So really, similarly to identifying what is the cause of the ear infection, you can think what is the cause behind the behavior I'm trying to change, and then I can devise the correct intervention, the best intervention to solve it. So really, diagnosis become an extremely important part, particularly given the wide array of reasons why people behave the way they do.
Thank you very much, Anna. That's great. We'll pass straight on to Paul, actually, because to keep us on track. But you brought up some important issues, which we'll probably bring back in plenary, and again reminded us this interesting sort of aspect of the importance of diagnosis, which I think is one of the key lessons. So over to Paul. Paul Litchfield is Chief Medical Officer for British Telecom, which is, for those who don't know, the UK is, I guess, the major telephone company within the UK. And it's also well known within the UK for being a company which has been in the forefront of using well-being and thinking about well-being for its staff. Paul is also, since the summer, the chair of the UK What Works Centre for Wellbeing, which I'm also partly involved in, so we have shared interests here, declare that, and is dedicated to understanding how you can get robust wellbeing evidence and use it in policy and practice. So I'll pass over to Paul. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Summer. As you alluded to or suggested, I come from a medical background, and as doctors, we are expected to understand how people think so that we can help them to change their behaviors. It's part of our professional skill set. We might not be very good at it, a lot of us, but it is meant to be part of the skill set. And those of us that have moved from dealing with individual patients to dealing with populations and trying to improve the well-being of populations have tended to find that over the years, and I've been involved with this for about 30 years now, you end up talking to the same small group of people year after year, and you make some progress, but my goodness, it's slow. And as I've moved into the broader field of well-being, it's become quite clear to me that exactly the same phenomenon has existed in a range of other disciplines. And I think the great strength, and what I found very uplifting on Tuesday here, was the way that as those different groups have come together, there's real traction. And to hear political leaders not just talking about well-being and behavioural insight, but actually embedding it, putting it at the heart of what they do, I found really stimulating and exciting. So that multidisciplinary heritage that we have is a huge strength, but it also causes practical difficulties. What you find when you try to pull evidence together is that that evidence is very siloed. There's little cross-fertilization between the different disciplines, and that causes difficulties. The language that the different groups use is really quite different. And even if one tries to become multilingual, that's only half of the solution, because the ways that people think from those different professional backgrounds is radically different. And therefore, the standards that they set, the way that they collect information, and the way that they analyze information is really quite disparate. What you therefore tend to find is that people who should be natural allies are often talking at cross purposes, and we waste an awful lot of valuable time and effort arguing about things like definitions, methodologies, and tools. And I'm reminded of what life was like in the 80s, not all of it, certainly not the music, which was pretty awful in those days. But at the time, there was a huge debate about stress, and there was one camp that said There's good stress and there's bad stress. And good stress is a stimulus and bad stress is harmful. And there was another group that said, no, 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 no. All stress is harmful because it's a demonstration that you can't cope with what's in front of you, and therefore, by definition, it's harmful. And eventually it got resolved. But we wasted 10 years arguing about that. And I hope we won't do the same with well-being and behavioural insights. And that's one reason why in the UK we've created the centre that Summer referred to, the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. It's a virtual organisation, as you'd expect in the second decade of the 21st century, and it's committed to the collation, the rating, the synthesis and the translation of evidence from all of those disciplines in order to create better policy, not just in public policymakers at all levels, but also in business and in the voluntary sector. We're aiming to operate as a cooperative of academics from all of those disciplines and to collaborate with those who use the evidence to produce something that will hopefully work for all. It's a new centre. We were only launched almost exactly a year ago and really started getting traction about 6 months ago with appointing staff and creating our programmes. We have 4 key programmes. One is around work and adult learning, one is around communities, one is around sport and culture, and then there's a cross-cutting theme that's aiming to give us a common set of definitions, a common set of methodologies. That centre, in turn, is part of a network of What Works centres in the UK. At the moment, there are 9 What Works centres looking not just at wellbeing, which is ours, but things like ageing, looking at the criminal justice system, looking at education, looking at health. And those, in turn, are convened by the Behavioural Insights Unit within the UK. I hope over the next 3 years, as we start to publish the outputs from those evidence programmes, that we will deliver stuff that will be of help to those who want to drive improved well-being. I have no doubt whatsoever that we will end up throwing up more questions than answers, but that's not a bad thing because that stimulates more research. But most importantly, what I hope we will do and what I hope all of us will contribute to doing is to change mindsets so that information, wherever it comes from, is valued appropriately and that we can use it to improve the human condition.
Thank you very much, Paul. Obviously, I won't ask you for any examples of what's come out of the What Works Centre because, as I well know, we're still at early days. But I would like to ask you, perhaps if you could reflect on some example of how behavioural insights have been used in your previous life at British Telecom, and I guess that would be interesting to reflect on the examples within the workplace.
Thank you. Well, it's also my current life because I do it half and half. So I said to someone the other day, you reach a stage in life where you think you're going to be able to give up work, and what you find is you get more and more jobs. I actually have 3 at the moment, which is a bit greedy, I think. When I think about where we've used this, it's probably best described in the managing of organisational change. That's something which, despite an awful lot of evidence, we do incredibly badly as a society. So in the commercial sector, where I've worked for the last 15 years, something like 2/3 of mergers and acquisitions go wrong. They destroy shareholder value. Might be good for the bankers and the analysts and all the others, but they destroy shareholder value, and in the process, they often destroy a lot of lives. And the reason that those mergers and acquisitions generally fail is because of cultural differences between the organizations that you're trying to bring together. But we do have an evidence base. The European Commission funded an excellent program called HIRES, Health and Restructuring, which started just before the economic crisis, and that's produced a lot of really valuable evidence that helps people to understand how you can restructure and at the same time mitigate harm to those involved. And I won't go into the detail of it all because there isn't time, but one of the key elements is that you pay attention to perceived justice and you think about the way that you are behaving and the way that that impacts on individuals. In 2008, early 2009, my company hit a perfect storm where not only did we have the economic downturn, but we also had a number of internal problems. And the business hit a very shaky patch. I mean, it was probably quite close to going under, actually. And I thought, well, I can't solve that problem for them, but what I can do is put together the evidence to try and help us to get the people through that difficult time. And I was pleased that the board took that on board. In fact, I was particularly pleased. The one thing they said to me is that enough? They didn't say, we don't want to do that. We don't want to help our people and do all those things. They said, are we doing enough? And because we applied those lessons to a major restructuring that we had to go through in that time, we changed the behaviors of those who were managing change. We changed the perceptions of those who were undergoing change. We suffered less misery, fewer deaths than we'd expect, because suicide is a big issue when you go through that sort of major change program. And also, we improved shareholder value. In fact, the share price has gone up by a factor of, my maths is awful, 6 since that time. So I think you can use it in practice. You can use it in a commercial context, which makes it really quite compelling for business leaders who have probably a disproportionate influence on our political leaders.
Thank you very much, Paul. And it reminds me, your last words reminds me of who has the power to use these tools, and sort of reminding us that certain people do have a lot of power and can make use of them for good, but not always necessarily for good. So that's a good example of it being used for good. I'm going to pass the last word over to Robert Frank, and I know that you're going to bring us back a little bit to a topic that was very relevant yesterday in terms of inequality. Robert Frank is Professor of Management and Professor of Economics, and it reminds me actually as well that we're a very multidisciplinary panel, that we have economists, medicine, management, public policy, and I'm a psychologist. Robert Frank has written, is famous for, he's a columnist in the New York Times, and he's written lots of books, including Choosing the Right Pond, Passions Within Reason, My Favorite Luxury Fever, and The Darwin Economy. So over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Sama, and thanks to the organizers and sponsors for inviting me to join this conversation. I've been studying inequality and well-being for more than 3 decades now, and for most of that time, most people didn't take much interest at all in either of those subjects, and it's a thrill now to see so much attention being showered on them. It's much deserved and about time. We have discussed inequality in the US, and I think in many other places, in terms of concepts like fairness and justice. And I think those are relevant concepts, but they're ones that reasonable people find it very easy to disagree on, and so the debate hasn't really made much progress on that account. I think it's much more promising to discuss the practical costs, if there are any, of rising income inequality. We'll be much more likely to move forward if we do that. And today I'll try to quickly defend what I think will strike most of you as an implausible claim. I claim that rising income inequality has spawned waste on a grand scale. In the US alone, I'd conservatively estimate $3 trillion a year. And more important, we could eliminate much of that waste with the stroke of a pen. A one-line amendment to the tax code would eliminate much of the waste that's been caused by inequality. So that's my task. I have, 4 minutes left to do that. I'll start with the only assumption that you need to adopt for my argument. It's that context shapes virtually every human evaluation. So suppose you're on an auto journey, you're going to cover a 25-kilometer distance, you've gone 20 kilometers so far, and your 10-year-old asks you, are we almost there yet? The answer, of course, is yes, you're almost there yet. If your journey had been 250 kilometers and you'd traveled 20 so far, and your 10-year-old asked the same question, are we almost there yet? What, are you kidding? No, we're not anywhere near almost there yet. It's the same amount of distance. Context shapes every evaluation. In particular, it frames the kinds of decisions we make when it comes to spend in important categories. So consider, for example, how much should we spend on our daughter's wedding? We want it to seem like a special occasion, but special is an inescapably relative concept. We want the guests to have a good time. How much do we need to spend? Well, in 1980, couples getting married in that year in the US in inflation-adjusted dollars spent $11,000 on their weddings. The most recent figures I could find for 2014, that average had climbed to $31,000. In New York, in Manhattan, the average is $76,000. So Joe Stiglitz reminded us yesterday that the median income hasn't gone up much. Why is it that the average couple is spending almost 3 times as much on the wedding? The simple reason is that the standards that define an adequate wedding have increased, and they've increased primarily because of the additional spending by top earners. Top earners have had an enormous increase in income. They're not behaving immorally when they spend more on everything. That's what everybody does when they get more income. And so they've spent more on their daughters' weddings. There's a group just below the top that attends those weddings, and being in the presence of those celebrations shifts their frame of reference. What do we need to do for our daughter? We then see that group spending more, and so on, step by step, all the way down the income ladder, so that now the average family is spending 3 times as much as before. But here's the rub. Does anyone want to assert that the couples getting married today are happier because they're spending $31,000 rather than $11,000? In fact, there's a recent study showing that the more today's couples spend on their weddings, the higher the probability of divorce in every month after the wedding. This is pure economic waste. These are real dollars that are being spent. They're dollars that could be used to achieve the kinds of essential goals that people have been talking all week about at the conference. There are lots and lots of cases like this. Let me illustrate with a simple thought experiment. Can I have my slide on the screen? No, that wouldn't be it.
Slide.
I had a slide. They promised me they'd be able to show. It's the slide of the Ferrari and the Porsche.
Here we go. It's there.
All right, there it is. So, sorry? No doubt. Who's happier? But these are people in 2 different worlds. They don't travel in the same circles. One drives a Ferrari F12 Berlinetta, $333,000. He drives it on roads riddled with foot-deep potholes. The other drives a Porsche 911 Turbo, which costs only $150,000, but he drives it on well-maintained, smooth highways. Which of these 2 gentlemen, and it's mostly gentlemen who make these purchases, which of these 2 gentlemen do you think is happier? This is a totally easy question to answer. You can quibble about whether the Ferrari is a better car. I know Anna is sure that it is. Car buffs might argue. Let's grant that it is. If it is, it's not much better. By the time you get to the Porsche worth $150,000, you've got every important feature already embedded in the car. So the Ferrari may have a slight edge if they're both driven on smooth roads, but let one be driven on potholed roads, the other on smooth roads, everybody thinks the Porsche driver would be happier. Well, that's an interesting observation, because in the US, the mix is much more like Ferraris on pothole-ridden roads than it is like Porsches on smooth ones. And for the cost of fixing the roads, it would be quite simple for everybody to not spend as much on a car, put those same dollars into paving the roads more smoothly. If that would make them happier, why don't they do it? That's an interesting question, one I don't have time to address, but the important insight is that when people spend more on mansions and on diamonds, beyond a certain point, it's all positional. Everybody spends more. Nobody's any happier than before. It's not that people are stupid. A nudge won't help get people onto the right track here. They may know they're spending in a way that collectively makes no sense. We all stand to see better, even though it's not possible to see any better that way than if we'd all remained comfortably seated. That doesn't mean you're stupid to stand. It's totally rational to stand when others are standing. What we could do is change people's material incentives about how they spend their last dollars. My proposal, which I've been advocating unsuccessfully for 30 years, is to scrap the income tax and replace it with a much more steeply progressive tax on each family's total consumption expenditure each year. That would make having a more expensive wedding twice as expensive as it is each dollar you add to it, and would provide all the incentive we need to steer those extra dollars into more productive uses.
Thank you very much, Robert. So you've obviously laid out a tough challenge to the audience. I mean, you said you've been trying to achieve this for 30 years, so and you've said that it would make sense for the rich to drive their Porsches on a smooth road. So why don't they do it?
Yeah, that's a tough question for my argument. So if the rich knew that by taxing themselves they'd have less money to spend, so they'd have to buy a Ferrari rather than a Porsche, but then that money could be used to fix the roads, why don't they vote for that? I think the answer is that when you think about the effect of extra taxes on you, you think that means I'd have less money. And most of the time when people have less money, that means they really are less able to buy what they want. When you have less money, it's occurred because you've had a divorce, your business has had a reverse, there's been some other event that has affected you but has left others with the same income as before. With a tax increase, everybody's income goes down a bit, and so the people who are bidding for the nice things in life, the houses with views of the lake or the city, those bidding contests are settled in exactly the same way after the tax increase as they were settled before the tax increase. But behaviorally, that's not the way that people think about taxes. They think, oh, my tax goes up, then I'll have less money, I won't be able to buy what I want. It's a very simple switch. You just report your income to the tax authorities. You report your annual savings, which people now do for retirement tax deductible accounts. And the difference between those two numbers, that's how much you spent. And we tax that after a big standard deduction for each family.
Thank you. Sounds like salience of the experience of paying taxes and how much something costs is very important. And it reminds me of Anna's comments about the tax in the US being added after you bought something. So we've got about 15 minutes for questions. I completely underestimated how long that would take, but that's okay. I've got a couple of questions on here, and then I'll throw it out to the floor. And I'm going to pick a question that came in quite early, and I think it's important because I think it's something that sort of, I don't know how to make this appear on the screen. If anyone else can do it, it's the question for the panel: how can we tie behavioral insights into the fight to dethrone GDP? So how can we tie behavioral insights into the fight to dethrone GDP? And I guess this is about linking a lot of the research that you're doing and the work that you're doing to the sort of broader question of this sort of national statistics. It's a tough one. Who wants to go for it?
How can we dethrone the GDP?
How can we link behavioral insights and all the things that we've been talking about today to the issue about, sort of questioning how we measure progress?
Criticism of the GDP as a measure of welfare goes back a long, long way, and there are probably a dozen valid objections to it as a comprehensive measure of welfare. I think the one that has been most important in recent decades has been that it takes no account of how income is distributed. And so if Bill Gates walks into a bar, the average income for people in the bar goes up by a factor of 100, but most of the people in the bar aren't doing any better than before he walked into the bar. Maybe they're doing a little worse as a result of his being there. But I think keeping track of how much people have to work in order to buy basic necessities is a much more realistic measure. I recently computed something I call the toil index. How many hours a month do you have to work to earn the rent for the median priced house in your area? That's what you have to do if your kid's going to go to an average quality school. If you pay less than that, the kids will be in below average schools. And it's gone from 40 hours a week in the 50s through the 1970s. It's now up over 100 hours a week. So that's a measure of how much tougher life has gotten as a result of inequality for people in the middle.
Anyone else? Okay. There's another question on here which has been liked a lot, so I think in a democratic sense we'll go with that one as well. It's a question, is there a meaningful difference between culture and behavior? And should we also be thinking about culture change? Obviously we've been talking about behavior change, but is there a is it a grey boundary between behavior change and culture change, or is there something clearer?
I think they're linked. I think culture helps to drive behavior. Culture is more of a group issue than behavior can be group, but behavior is more individual. So I think they're linked, but they're not the same thing. I think if you're going to swat the fly away, I think if you're going to change behavior, you've got to address culture. And you've got to think about which cultures are going to have the biggest effect on the group that you are looking to influence. Yeah. So I think they're both important.
Elisa?
Yeah, if you think about behavior as Anna and Robert and Paul, we've all alluded to, it's really a factor of context that you're in. And context can shape a lot of things. The context can give you social cues of how to act, which is often very much reinforced and shaped by the culture that you're in. And there are also context could be the features of something, of a program or a policy that makes you react and respond in a certain way. And we think about it in terms of how can we actually move that behavior. If you look across cultures, you see a lot of the same behavioral biases. And so a lot of the behavioral insights really do function across cultures. There are some that are weaker than others across cultures, but you see these really strong tendencies across cultures. We actually, just with the World Bank, we helped with a WDR survey, and we looked across 4 different continents, 4 different countries there, at some of the strong behavioral biases where we could apply behavioral insights, and we found that there were just really strong similarities across all of these continents, even when some of them are considered very different cultures, some maybe more individualistic, some more community or group-oriented than others. And so ultimately, though, I think the importance is really thinking about the context you're in, whether you're within a culture or country or across culture or countries, what is that specific context that you're in? And from there, you can diagnose what's going on and solve it with the right insight.
Thank you very much. It reminds me of, in the morning, we were talking about the 3 things that we need to achieve change, particularly in terms of environmental issues. And one of the 3 things mentioned was information, and there was some questioning about whether information was enough. And I was itching to say, well, actually, culture actually was a 4th thing that wasn't mentioned. The values that are instilled within a culture, I think, are really important and probably very important for tackling climate change. We have about 8 more minutes for questions from the floor. So, okay, so we'll start with the gentleman over there in the white shirt. Yeah, thank you. And then you.
Can you stand up, please? I can hold.
Andrew Coleman from the University of Otago. I have a question for Anna, or for the panel, which stems from my own use as an occasional generator of surveys. You talked about the way that the framing of prices affects expenditure. We also know that framing affects survey responses. How much should we insist that surveys of social well-being or preferences use multiple framing? And should we be implementing standards before we start using such data as we've been using for the last 3 days?
Okay, we'll take a few if that makes sense. There was another one, I think. Oh yeah, okay. Gentleman over there. Okay. It's a ballet going on with the microphone in case you can't see it. So.
Hi. Maybe I was wondering that if it is the fact that people are not ultimately in control of how taxes are spent, the reason of why people prefer the Ferrari instead of the Porsche 911. That's it. Thank you.
So, did you get that? Okay. We have a third question. I think it was directed at Robert, so if you can repeat it when it comes. And okay, yeah, just this one last third question at the front here.
If I may, I'd like to try and answer the question that came from the audience about how can behavioral insights be used to help dethrone GDP. I think the answer lies in an insightful comment in David Halpern's recent book, Inside the Nudge Unit. He says there's an unfinished part of the behavioral agenda, which is to rethink the objectives of what kind of behavior is to be changed. And once you start doing these experiments with an eye to improving people's life satisfaction, you soon find you can get very big increases, and typically the answers don't involve material resources, and as soon as people see those answers and see how they work, they'll immediately start changing their notion about what the objectives of their action should be to make their lives better.
Thank you, John. And actually, can I add a question to that? Just following up from what John Helliwell said, what do people think about what John Helliwell said? That somehow, if we can understand a little bit more about what is important to people's well-being, then we might realize that material goods are less important. So,
I think that would help, but there are limits to that. So, if you think people would be happier if they had more savings, or they'd be happier if they took more time to spend with family and friends, there are good, solid studies supporting both of those claims. And then you merely made that information available to people. Say, here are the studies that show where everyone saves more, they're happier. When everyone spends more time with family and friends, they're happier. That by itself, I don't think would be enough to get people to change their behavior. On the savings front, my choice as a parent is to save an adequate amount for retirement, or to bid for a house in a better school district. If I take my retirement savings and bid for a house in a better school district, I'm going to have to eat pet food in retirement. But if the alternative is to send my child to a bad school, that's a risk I'll take. And so I think we would all be glad to save more if we knew we all would do it, as happens when in New Zealand they take a mandatory payment from everyone's check. For me to save voluntarily, there are limits to the extent to which I would be willing to do that, even if I knew it would be good if we all did it.
Anna? Yeah.
Yes, on the question on framing and surveys, yeah, I couldn't agree more. We realize how the way in which we frame questions changes the way in which the respondent, even the order. It's amazing, the order in which one presents, the set of questions changes the way in which people answer, depending on what was answered first. Hence, being aware that these things are really important and what the consequences are matters. Similarly, it depends on, because of the context in which surveys are being done and who the respondent is, also that matters. In many, regular surveys, household surveys or labor force surveys, we see in many countries how the statistics that we find are not as convincing. They're not can be reconciled with what is observed on the ground. Women from the survey seems not to be working as much, and then you ask people around. People are working. What is the definition of what makes a woman work? Depending if it's the husband who works or what is considered work in a specific context matters. So, I think that this understanding, these insights, are incredibly important. It should be taken into account when designing any type of survey, and one should be particularly careful then in understanding that the results that you get are a function of the way in which the survey has been administered and the way in which the questions have been asked.
Thank you, Anna. Elisa, Paul, do you have anything you want to add to that?
It's more picking up on the comment, I suppose, about the Ferrari and the Porsche. So I think it comes down to trust, ultimately, whether people trust their governments to make the right decision. And I think it's a bit depressing that over the last 20 years around the world, I think the level of trust in governments generally has declined. Why that might be, I think, is beyond the couple of minutes that we've got left to debate. But there is then the fundamental political question of, is someone else better placed to make the decision about how to spend my money than I am? And I'm not sure that we can solve that with behavioural insights. If we can frame things in a way that make things more appealing to people, then they might feel less bashful about paying their taxes. But it is a fundamental political difference across the world.
Thank you.
That problem has... That problem has gotten worse in the United States since Ronald Reagan's administration, when government was portrayed not as the solution to problems, but the very problem itself. And it's been exacerbated recently by liberalization of our campaign finance laws, which give citizens very good reasons not to trust what their legislators are doing. So I think the very first step on my agenda would be to roll back some of the recent court decisions on campaign finance regulation.
And is there any other way of making behavioural insights more democratic without, I mean, is there any way of doing it without relying on the government, but it also being bottom-up?
There must be, but some of the biggest problems, the ones that result in the biggest waste, are ones where mere nudges aren't enough. I think it's a bad framing to say the government's telling me what to do. I think we want to think about stop signs and speed limits and other things as being us telling ourselves that as individuals we shouldn't be able to do whatever we want, because what we want to do as individuals doesn't add up to a good outcome for the group as a whole. So we're regulating ourselves, but sometimes we really do need to have hard incentives rather than soft ones.
Elisa, Anna.
Just now they were talking, I think that one important distinction is to be made between, like behavioral insights in general and then nudges. Nudges are just one element of the toolbox. And when you talk about nudges, it's usually small tweaks and little things that you do. For example, when I was giving the example of the letter that you send to the different taxpayers. But then there are broader, but this is, if you just think of behavioral insights as nudges, it's very limiting, right? I think that the reflection, the behavior, or the opportunity that this behavioral, reflecting on the potential for behavioral insights, or behavioral informed policies, is just that you really need to understand how people think and how people react to information, to campaign. It's not just enough to say, we have, as a government, we have a product out there that works, like we have a program. Let's say, in the US, to support low-income families to attend colleges, kids from low-income families. There are a lot of money, there is a lot of money available and not enough families who take advantage of it. And you think, why aren't they, the money's there, it's supposed to help low-income kids access college, why don't they use it? Well, the problem is that then they found out one of the big deterrent is that filling out these forms is very complicated. And many of these lower income kids have families who don't have a lot of education, and for them it's even more intimidating than for everyone. Like if you have to fill out a 15 pages form with all the type of information, don't even understand what it means, it's very difficult. So you have a program out there. It's not the availability of the program and the fact that there is a demand for this program that it's enough. You also need to make the program suitable, and the way, like the registration, enrollment in the program needs to be easy enough that people then take advantage of it. And this can make a big change, because then this might mean kids, kids going to college versus kids stopping in high school. So this can be a major change. It's not, and this is not, this I wouldn't define a nudge, is realizing that simplifying and trying to make things easy is just a winning way of making a program actually effective and do its work.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. You've demonstrated examples of how it is being used at the moment and having great impacts, and I think sort of suggested of some ways that we might find that behavioural insights might be influencing our politics, but also our societal thinking as society as well in the future. So thank you very much to all of you.
Muchas gracias al moderador y a nuestros panelistas. Vamos a despedirlos del escenario con un fuerte aplauso, por favor.